Hi, Gwe, Deluisi, Trina, Trina Roach. I am here in Mikmaq, in Nova Scotia, and I am waiting for Jessie Wente to join me. This is part of the Writers Trust Amplified Voices campaign. So authors who published during the pandemic, who kind of missed that traditional book signing agreement or book signing opportunity that we normally would have. They didn't get that. We're starting, I hope, to come out of the pandemic. But it's an important, it's important to celebrate authors. For me, it was really important to celebrate authors who are representing marginalized voices. And so Jessie Wente was one of the top picks. I read his book, I think, as soon as it came out. I think that I will get his, oh, there he joined. Jessie Wente joined. There. Your request. Go live with. Are you there, Jessie? I'm like still trying to figure out Instagram Live. This is my first ever Instagram Live. And I think I did it. Go ahead, Jessie. Jalasi, welcome. Can you hear me? Are you able to hear, Jessie?
I'm so sorry. I thought I could join from my iPad, and it wouldn't let me join from my iPad.
Oh no! Well, you're here
now. I'm here now. I'm going to figure out how to hold my phone. Don't worry, folks.
We were all set up. See, this is the thing. We were all good to go, but technology.
Okay, here we go.
Here we go. So you can hear me, okay?
I can indeed. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. It's so good to talk to you. Welcome, Jalasi. Welcome to this Instagram Live. I was just in the process of explaining what the Writers Trust Amplified Voices is about, but also trying to make sure I was letting you in. So I think I was a little distracted when I was explaining it. But the Amplified Voices campaign really was to make sure that authors who published during a pandemic and kind of missed that traditional, you get to go and you sign a book for a long line of people and you have those meet and greets. All that fanfare has been missing. And so as we're sort of heading back into normal, I don't know, this pandemic's unpredictable. But this is a way to sort of generate some publicity and some excitement about your book, which I think for your book is there. I certainly have heard, I heard you talk to Sheila Rogers. I've heard you on the radio talking about it, but I'm so glad to have an opportunity myself to talk to you. So welcome. Here, I'll introduce you. I didn't even introduce myself yet, Jessie. So I'm Trina Roach.
Oh, please start there. Yeah.
I'll start here and then I'll get to you. So I'm Trina Roach. I am a Mikmaw mixed ancestry journalist. There's some Irish in there too. And I said I'm here in Mikmaq. I live in Nova Scotia, and I worked for APTN for a very long time. I've done some work for CBC, and now I'm teaching journalism at the University of King's College as the Rogers Chair in Journalism. I'm an avid reader and an avid movie watcher, so we can talk about movies. Yeah, I was really excited to have been asked to be on the Writers Trust Committee. And my goal, I think, for myself was to really amplify Black and Indigenous voices. And so, to make sure that there was space in the campaign for those voices. And I think everyone who was on the committee had that same intent. And so I'm really excited about the books that are going to be promoted for this, starting with yours. So Jessie, you are an Anishinaabe writer, broadcaster, and arts leader. Born and raised in Toronto. His family comes from Chicago, and you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation.
Oh, Genaabaajing.
What did you say it again?
Genaabaajing, or what they would call the Serpent River First Nation.
Oh, is that the Ojibwe word for it? Genaabaajing.
Genaabaajing would be our word for it, yes.
Oh, okay. Is it an equal translation to Serpent River? No.
No, not at all. It's the more more traditional name of the community. The community, the Serpent River runs right beside the community and was traditionally part of it. But no, it's not as with most things, there's not really a direct translation.
No. So your family's from the Serpent River First Nation. And as you talk about in your book, you have really renewed your connection to community there. You were appointed chair of the Canada Council for the Arts in 2020, the only First Nations person to ever hold that position. And your book, Unreconciled, Family Truth, and Indigenous Resistance, argues that the concept of reconciliation is flawed. And your book is a call to build a new, respectful relationship between the nation of Canada and Indigenous peoples. That is a tall order, so let's get started. That was ambitious.
I'm glad we're going to do it on Instagram Live. That seems very appropriate.
Yeah, it does. And I was admitting at the first time that you have gone Instagram Live, and I did not. This is my first time, so I'm very excited just to be on Instagram Live for the Writer's Trust. But you write in here, one of your quotes is, I'm just reading it so I get it right. Storytelling is one of our best weapons in the fight to reclaim our rightful place. And you talk a lot about how storytelling and narrative has been weaponized against us, but it's one of our best weapons. So why was it so important for you to tell your own story?
Yeah, I mean, I struggled with that very question, I think, for a long time. I'd been asked to write a book before and had sort of always been a bit flummoxed about what exactly I would write about. And then 2017 happened, and it was a year that sort of, I think, did sort of happen to a lot of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit folks, the sesquicentennial, and for Canada. And I guess it was during the course of that and engaging in all of the, various, I don't want to call them debates, but discourse that came out of that particular year. I guess I sort of decided that maybe my own story might lend some insight or value to that conversation, or at least help. I would say this, that year made me very sick, to be honest. I can understand that now, but I'm not sure I totally grasped that in the moment. So I felt very unwell, and there was all of this going on, and so yes, I hope people would find value, and I figured I had something to say. To be honest, Trina, I also wanted to write this so that for my kids, because I wasn't sure in 2017 how long I was going to be around. And so there was an urgency to write this so that they may understand why I did some of the things I did, or some of the choices I made, some of the history. They were, at the time I started writing it, I'm much younger, they're teenagers now, but when I started in 2017, it's 5 years later. So they've gone from, preteen to tween to teen in the course of writing this book. They're still not particularly interested in reading it in the moment, but I think it was, for me, I think it had become important in that moment to just try to get this stuff down for them, and then hope that might be valuable to others. And hopefully that's still what I hope for the book, I think that's all you can really do with storytelling, is tell the story and hope that other people do find value in it.
Well, it does say in the jacket, a part memoir and part manifesto. That's kind of in the caption of the book. But that is a very challenging, you weave this narrative that's very personal in with, a ongoing colonial narrative. And when we live our lives, we go to school, we work, we have kids. I mean, sometimes we're just, we're we're not really thinking so critically about our own existence and the impact of colonialism on ourselves. And what would, like, how challenging was that for you to really understand, like, on a personal level, the impact, not just on you, but through that line, right? That sort of line from your grandparents, your parents, yourself and your kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of my life, or maybe not just mine, but I think for many of us, that is just an ongoing part. And I would say I'm not sure I'm done fully understanding all of it. I would say just in the last year, frankly, a lot of those things have come back up in terms of just wrestling with all of that. I think that's one of the impacts, I guess I would say, of colonialism, is it tends to leave us sort of always trying to remain connected. And connected has become, has a lot of meanings, but I mean sort of connected to ourselves and who we are and the earth and all of this sort of the stuff that Anishinaabe would see as really valuable. That is such a struggle. And so I think that's an ongoing part of it. I think for me, that's really what crystallized and why I wanted to write the book, is that it suddenly dawned on me, if I look at my life, I can sort of look at some of the systemic issues, but through a very personal lens. And so that was always the intent of the book. The format was not without its challenges. I think that was my hardest task was sort of wrestling that idea of using the personal life to explore systemic issues. Seems simple to say that as a concept before you've put finger to type to keyboard. A year or so in, if you'd ask me, I'd say, oh, don't ever decide that that's wise, because it's really hard. But I think to me that was always the point, because I think that for a lot of people, systemic issues, particularly those that have been so purposefully obscured and made opaque or buried, sadly, quite literally, I think for a lot of folks, those issues can be hard to grasp and hard to necessarily feel, and certainly can be hard to understand the day-to-day impacts of something that I may not have actually personally experienced, but it's something experienced by someone in my family, or how that manifests itself for a family today, they may not know. And so for me, this was also an opportunity to boil down some of those systemic things and say, well, this is actually how it has personally affected me, and by extension, my family and the community. And then I think more broadly, a lot of other Indigenous folks. I think that's always the key with storytelling, is we think, I think some think that if you're super specific, it won't be universal, when it's actually the quite opposite, right? Being super specific is what allows people to say, right, that's not exactly me, but I feel it. And so that was really always the intent. And I'm hopeful that we got pretty close on it.
Well, it is funny, because I had mentioned to you just before that, I connected with a lot just myself. I think we are, same vintage. Yeah. I can picture linoleum quite well, thank you, on the floor. But even just in terms of, kid of the 70s, growing up in the city. My grandmother was Mikmaq, spoke the language, but moved to the city. My dad and all his brothers grew up in Halifax, not speaking Mikmaq. That was not something that my grandmother was going to pass on. She was embarrassed. She wouldn't even speak it in front of people. She would switch to English. So not passing that on. And then, having lost status, you talk about the Indian Act and the gender, and then coming back in under Bill C-31 in 1985. And me as a teenager, not really having a sense of what that meant, but then that sense of obligation, so many things that you talk about in the book, and this, it's this, are you Ojibwe enough? Am I Mikmaq enough? And so I'm just wondering, what kind of feedback have you gotten from people who've read the book. It's a two-parter question, which you never double barrel. So I'll just ask the feedback, and then I'll ask my other question.
It seems to have resonated with people, like that same sort of feeling. I've been in therapy for the past more than a year and a bit now, and which has been great, saved my life, absolutely. And one of the things that that we're working on is that sense of being enough, and not whether Ojibwe enough, just being enough, period. And it does strike me that this is something a lot of people struggle with. I would say it's also something that particularly colonialism for our folks really drove a pretty hard wedge into that sense. Because I think there's, very clearly the sort of colonial culture was telling us, well, we're not enough. You have to become us in order to be enough for us, right? So you have to do exactly what your mother did, right? Abandon the language, abandon the culture. So many of our grandparents, great-grandparents, parents made this exact choice because it was felt too hard or whatever, or they didn't even realize it was a choice that they could make. And maybe it wasn't, because I'm not sure for my grandmother it really was a choice that was open to her. So I think for us, it makes you not feel enough in the broader society. So like where I grew up in Toronto, still struggle to feel enough there. Go back to what I would today call home, which even though I've never lived there, in the Serpent River, and getting better, but has certainly for a time been struggle to feel like I was enough or a part of that community. So then you're left adrift. And I think that does resonate with people. And I wanted to make sure, because I think with all of these things, and it's certainly been important for me to understand, is that was intentional, right? Like that is not me or my community doing that. That was something that was done to us. And the healing part is on us. The part that did it has not been great on helping us heal through this. But like, I think in naming that intention, it at least can help remove some of the shame or guilt we might feel that's associated with that feeling of not being enough, because it isn't us that determine this. And one of the other things I've learned, Trina, for sure, is even when I have these moments, and today's absolutely one of them where I'm having moments of doubt and anxiety and all of that. But I've also learned that for my community, I'm absolutely enough. For my family, I'm enough. That all of that has been very gratifying. And that's what helps in these moments when you may question. I'm a reminder. I mean, sitting upstairs is a lovely package sent to me by the Anishinaabe Nation for a talk I did with them last week. And it's, I look at that and I go, the doubts I'm having are just in my brain. They're not actually reflective of what my community thinks.
It is a very, identity now is a conversation. It's an act of resistance, right? To say, no, it didn't work. Here we are. But at the same time, it is a conversation that's fraught with just so many difficulties, and you address them in the book. You talk about, there are those, we might call them pretendians, or
sure,
people sort of going back to the ancestor in the 1600s, and that sort of dawning of Indigenous identity, where inappropriate. But then you also have these sort of tenuous connections that are like, there's reasons that people lose connections. 60 Scoop, residential school impact, Bill, like I said, I think I said Bill C-35 earlier, but I meant Bill C-31. But that loss of status, right?
Yeah.
And that bill was sort of a way to address it and get everyone back. But then you're a Bill C-31er, right? then you're in that category. So it's just like another category. But it was like, now, did you that's a difficult topic that you delve into in a lot of ways, and to put it all out there, was there trepidation on your behalf?
I mean, totally, and especially given that, I've had a very personal experience with this phenomenon. I made a movie with someone who, made claims that clearly they couldn't substantiate. This was, this is why I'm in therapy. that experience, and I'm still struggling with it. We're doing this on Instagram Live. It was just announced that the movie is going to be shown on APTN in a few weeks, and I'm struggling, even though I'm very proud of the people in the film, and we worked really hard to, it's been a year of talking with them and trying to figure out what to do with this thing that we created. And it's so I certainly know the incredible harm and pain that is associated with this. To me, there are two different issues, right? Like there's those where their connection was really interrupted by the state. You're talking about 60s Scoop residential school, like all those folks that are descendants of those people. And frankly, any people who've lived as Indigenous people in the last century and a half, say, if you throw a random number out, know how painful all of that is. Know that we've been deprived of necessarily keeping our own kinship and citizen models, like how we would actually determine who's who. Like you're talking about acts in a colonial government. It's ridiculous that level of disruption. So to me, like that is a specific thing, and we need to be really careful and loving and try to bring those kids back, whether they're now adults or not, to heal from that. The other thing is folks who make claims, based on ancestors who they haven't met, who are long ago, and whose families at some point really stopped identifying as Indigenous people, and likewise their communities didn't necessarily view them that way either. And I say this as someone like my grandmother moved to Toronto. My great-grandparents had to make the incredibly painful decision to move out of community to keep their younger children away from the Indian agent, so they wouldn't go to the residential school. So like these are really incredibly difficult choices that our ancestors had to make. But I would also say, like, these aren't ancestors that I didn't know. Like my name, Noden, my middle name, comes from my great-grandparents, from when they met me.
Yeah.
I lived with my grandmother. She cooked me breakfast. And so I often think that, when I think about this work, it's like, I know very much who I'm doing this for. Like these were living, breathing people to me. They're still living and breathing people to me. I think for those that they didn't know that, and those folks, it's not that they didn't know them because they were disconnected from colonialism. It's that they didn't know them, that they weren't alive. Like the family stopped. I think that's a different matter. And listen, Trina, I've got a ton of space in my heart for folks who have Indigenous ancestry and want to be allies and want to learn about that I got so much space. I have less space if you're going to pursue opportunities that so many have worked so many to regain when you don't necessarily have those connections. And it is incredibly complicated. You can probably feel the pain that it brings up from me just in the conversation.
Yeah.
But I would say that I'm while it is very hard, I'm gratified that our communities are now having these conversations, that we are trying to seek remedies and solutions. And I hope that we can, ultimately, as we go through this, maintain ourselves, because I've tried to use my experience to better understand myself, to better understand all of this, to try to make the best out of what was a terrible, terrible situation that I will probably feel for the rest of my life, but to try to go about resolving that to use the phrase that we hear so often, we use so often, to try to do it in a good way, because I think that's sort of what we have to do when we face all of these situations. But I would say those notions of identity are very powerful. And I think one of the key things we should keep in mind is that identity, when we treat it as an individual thing, as something that the individual claims, without thinking of community and relationship and kinship and all those things, then I think we get into a notion. I think we're getting a little far from how our folks tended to imagine identity and how we exist with one another.
I know, because we do always have that, you know, where you're from, who's your mother, who's your father, who's your grandma. Like, we have those sort of questions that are just expected. They're not to grill you. That's just how you identify where, you know, where are you from? Who do you belong to? They're just standard introductory questions. I think I wandered around reserves for when I first started working at APTN, which was a great way for me to connect. Because I grew up in the city, and growing up in Halifax in the 70s, I did not see myself reflected at all. And so, you know, I learned in a mainstream classroom absolutely nothing, right? Like, you didn't learn it there. And so very much learning, like making that effort in communities, and but always having to like sort of just answer who I was. And it was just you know, that's just, and then you would see how you were connected, and it was just part and parcel.
You're totally correct. Like, I remember that was always a question. Mm-hmm. And I would say that in my experience, it's when you ask those simple questions that people can tell on themselves in their response to those, because that was my experience. But I would also say it's important that we ask those questions, because I didn't, and that part I'll have to carry. I trusted, and it's tough because Anishinaabe, we like to trust, we like to be generous, and maybe I shouldn't have trusted, but that's a hard one. I don't know how to reconcile that. Thus the title of my book. That's one of the many things I will struggle to reconcile. But I do think those simple questions, because, you know, for Indigenous folks, when we answer, no matter how painful the answer is, we know, we understand. It's in my family. It's not like I don't need to shy away from those things. They're what we're healing from. So it's okay to do that part. And again, I think we need to ask those questions, and people need to be open to answering them with the understanding that we're just trying to place each other, right? Just trying to decide how we're cousins.
It's interesting. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. As you said, like, it's emotional for you. Like, I can hear that it's emotional now to talk, like, but there's different parts in the book. Like, and I mean, that whole, and I remember listening on the radio and hearing you talk about, because it was in the wake of the appropriation prize and that whole skerfuffle. And you had tweeted out, I think I wrote it down. You tweeted out, what was that tweet you said about the appropriation?
Oh, the famous tweet.
Just so we're clear, there already is an appropriation prize. It's called Canada. Yeah. And I remember that tweet, but I remember listening to you talk on the radio, on CBC radio, and you described that not the interview with Jonathan Kay, but when you were talking with Matt, and I think it was Metro Morning, is that what it's called?
Yeah, Matt Galloway. Yeah.
Yeah, it went on. I ended up listening to that, and then
whenever,
and the emotion and feeling emotional, but even like getting emotional as I read that part in the book, and then you talk about your Nugamus. Is that how you say it in Ojibwe?
Yeah, Nugamus. Yeah.
I think Mikmaq. I'm trying to learn Mikmaq, and they're very similar. They're the same language group, so a lot of similarities. I always say Cree, because APTN does the hockey night in Canada in Cree, and I'm like, wow, that sounds totally different. But Ojibwe sounds kind of similar, right?
Yeah.
But you talk about feeling her with you there, and feeling, and it hit me, and I got emotional. I get emotional when I heard you on the radio. When I read your book the first time, that struck a chord with me. Maybe because I can feel that. I have that similar sort of experience or feeling and memories of my grandmother. But you know, that was a huge, like, I mean, when you look back on that, like, and that you had to speak out, you felt this obligation. And I mean, what was that like when you think back on that time and that conversation that sort of had to happen? But you were the one, and you said, like, you really, that was a very, very hard time.
It was. It's interesting. I'm having the same sort of feeling in this conversation with you right now, Trina, because she's here. She's here because I'm, in a little bit of pain. I think she's come to give me a hug. But yeah, I mean, I think, with both my grandmothers, they were so huge in my life in terms of just formating like who I am and how I understand that I sort of feel them at all times. My non-Indigenous grandmother, who was a very smart businesswoman, she often, pops up when I'm doing stuff. She's, oh, remember, and then or when I'm tending my roses, because she was big on the roses. And then with Norma, just she's sort of there all the time, just trying to encourage me. I think, with that one in the book, I tried to describe the whole situation because we're trained as broadcasters. This was my training at the CBC, was that you're not emotional. You don't do that. It's not a thing that should happen. And so it was absolutely not my intention to be emotional on the radio that day. But I really struggled because of all sorts of stuff that happened that weekend and just the feelings of all of it. I had struggled to even write the column. I just couldn't. I had some sort of rough notes for when I did it, and sort of just like here, I didn't have anything when I came to talk to you. And Trina, look what you managed to get out of me. I think, because I think ultimately, how would I put this? I couldn't stop myself. I would have stopped myself from being emotional if I could have on the radio. But I also think that the piece probably wouldn't have been as powerful for some folks. Because in the end, just like I hope, people who eventually watch this will feel, like we have to be vulnerable with each other. It's how we sort of learn and how we grow with one another. And, so sometimes you have to break the facade a little bit. And in the end, I think it was completely unintentional, but it was very effective in terms of, I think people could hear and ultimately see, because they also recorded it for video at the time, so it lives on in YouTube. You could see that I was, emotional. You could hear it. And that for their listeners, because by that point I'd been on radio for 20 years in Toronto, they had never heard me emotional other than maybe giddy over the release of like a new movie or something, but never emotional like that. I think that it helped in part just what I was feeling, not just what I was saying, but the feeling behind my words. And I think those things are important, and I try to be careful around them. It's for my own spirit and sanity and all of that stuff. I sort of knew coming in today that this conversation might be emotional with you. It has been, but in the end, I'm grateful for it. And one thing I've always tried to do in these conversations, both that day and here today with you, is I just try to bring my whole self to these things. Mm-hmm. And if that means I get emotional, these days I'm way more accepting of that. I'm no longer a professional broadcaster. We're on Instagram Live, so maybe emotion is a bit more not, it's out of the style book of, maybe that's actually in the style book for IG Live. It wasn't in for CBC News. But I just try to bring my whole self, and that's why, I want to say to you, Trina, I really appreciate you doing this conversation and the way you've done it, and for all the work that you've done. I'm such an admirer of yours, and it's been a real honor to that you would do this with me today, and everything you've done with the Writers Trust for this. I just, miigwech, chi miigwech.
Well, Alan, thank you. We'll just ask a couple more questions because we are already at 3:34. But I did want to ask, just as you're talking, I do want to get to Avatar. before I go.
Okay.
But as you're talking, because when you talk about storytelling as this, just back to that initial point, right? Storytelling is a weapon we can use. But when you're talking, you also, you know, you have that history as a broadcaster, just like me. And we sort of, you know, I mean, I went to J school. I learned video journalism. Well, actually, I did radio. I started in radio myself before I went over to APTN and learned how to operate a camera. But there's very much, you know, there's those journalistic principles and tools and ethics and CP style and all the standard sort of tools. And I have struggled over the years with what is Indigenous journalism? Like, how does that look and feel any different? Maybe it's just, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just that it's about Indigenous stories. But there's sort of, it's always been kind of a struggle. So do you find with storytelling, like, how do we inform, like, so that we're making it ours? Like, did you find, have you found a way to do that? Have you found, I mean, you know, sort of any insight into how Indigenous storytelling can be different when we're often using a craft and tools that are very much just sort of standardized?
I do think it is different. I think we're still rediscovering how it's different in 2022, because I think part of what's happened is, like, all of the stuff we used to do was all disrupted. So all of the ways we would have formerly reported on news or passed that sort of information along was disrupted. So we're sort of finding our way. And I would say, like, we shouldn't, I'm not sure that's a set thing yet. I'm not sure we've actually figured that out. Because I think if you look at the evolution of Indigenous, say, I would say put film as the, you know, my main passion and the thing I followed, like, it is radically different today in 2022 than it was in 1970 when it sort of started, right? Yeah. And I would say but I would say some of the ethical or sort of approach is similar in terms of, like, I think of, you know, we would call them in Anishinaabe the 7 grandparent teachings. They're not universal to all nations, so I wouldn't put them on anyone else. But I think of how, when I think of those teachings, I think of how to embed them in just everything we do. And that might mean some of the way we approach journalism, like notions of objectivity, actually becomes sort of impossible, right? Because if part of what I'm living is in relationship and, like, well, then how am I, if I'm in relationship, how can I step out of that relationship to somehow report on that? Like, I can't. And so I think what we have to do is sort of continue to iterate and figure out and arrive at what Indigenous, and I think we'll arrive maybe at what Indigenous journalism is, and maybe that's where we're at now. I think more interesting, Trina, is when we get further, as we regain more and more, we're going to arrive at a place where it's Mikmaq journalism and Anishinaabe journalism and Inuk journalism, and we'll actually be discussing, hopefully amongst ourselves, well, what are the shared similarities and how do we work together to sort of, what are the common approaches and causes? Just like in cinema right now, I think there's this, and again, colonialism does this, it sort of wants this pan-Indigenous approach.
Yeah.
Okay, but if I had to guess where we're going, we'll stop talking about Indigenous cinema in, say, 20 years, and we'll be talking about Mikmaq or Anishinaabe cinema, and it will have been more separated as we regain all of these things. And I think so, just embedding some of how we already operate differently. And we know how we operate differently. We operate much more collectively, much more in relationship. That tends to be universal, not always with nations, but, you know, tends to be shared sort of things. That, I think if you actually just operated that way, journalism would look different. It would look radically different. And I do think we need to approach that. I also think journalism and storytelling in general, when it gets caught up in capitalism, and journalism has been there for many decades, that makes some of those things really hard, because that actually becomes the driving force.
My kid just called, and I'm wondering if that gets recorded into the Instagram Live.
I hope so. I'm hopeful.
I declined it, but I'm like, He called twice, so let's just see. It is interesting. I have a whole lecture on the myth of bias, because all it does is it assumes objectivity lives in the Western white guy sort of worldview, and everyone else is othered. So, but I will say, as much as as someone who's done this for a long time, who looks at things with a very critical eye, apparently, when you hand me a box of popcorn and I'm sitting in a theater, that all goes out the window, because I watched Avatar and I was like, wow, that was great. And I mean, I watched it at the time, and then I'm reading your book and I'm like, oh no. I think it was like page 137. And you wrote, it reduces our identity to a garment that a white person can wear so convincingly that it fools even us. And you called it a step back for Indigenous representation in film. And then I was like, oh yeah, I saw it. And then I saw other movies and I was like, wow. And that's like, we really we also have to like sort of undo that colonial narrative, right? It's so pervasive. But you also called that sort of like seemed like a turning point for you, or you referred to it as a turning point. What changed for you at that point? If you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, first I would say it is okay to just enjoy movies. One does not always have to, or TV shows or whatever. We don't always have to dissect them. I do. That's literally my life. I can't help it. I can't not do it. My family, just ask my son about watching Book of Boba Fett with me. It's not always fun, folks. But so I can't help it, but I leave that others can. For me, the thing with Avatar was, I'd been a film critic by that point for more than 10 years, almost 15 years by that point. But Hollywood had largely ceased making Westerns for that period. Like I sort of came after the Dances with Wolves moment, and before there was really a full-fledged sort of Indigenous cinema renaissance, which we got in the 2000s, sort of right before Avatar. So I started then, and so like, there was no reason for a lot of the time for me to mention that I was Indigenous as part of a review. Avatar, it was very clear to me in the theater watching it for the first time that my reaction to the film was just different than everyone else in the theater's reaction. And so I knew when leaving it that my review was not going to be the same, and that the reason it wasn't was the same was because of who I am. And because I had to, I could only see the movie through, and this is true of all movies. Like I can only see them from where I sit, and so I tend to, and so for me it was a turning point in that I knew that on that review, if it hadn't been clear, and by the reaction to that review, it wasn't clear to the Metro Morning audience that I was First Nations at all. They had no idea. My community did, and they heard that review and they loved it. They thought it was the greatest thing, and yeah, and so for me it was just that moment where there's a couple things happened. I realized like my identity was part of how I saw film, and I couldn't extract the two things. It also really galvanized for me, and at the time I had just started programming I had been programming at the Toronto Film Festival for a while. I was just about to leave to start a new job, running their movie theater and their building for them. And it really became clear to me, like, right, I can review movies, but if these are the movies I'm going to have to review, I'm not going to like it. Mm-hmm. And so it became part of more of a drive to try to change the types of movies that people got to review, knowing that I wasn't going to do that anymore, but that at least maybe we can change. Now, I say that, I think, I was part of, or have been privileged to be part of, a movement where that has changed. The movies we see today are radically different than the movies or TV shows or video games or whatever that we saw when I was a kid. That said, we've got, I don't know how many Avatar sequels coming, at least a couple of them. Like, there's sure to be these huge blockbusters with theme parks and all this stuff. So, like, it hasn't stopped, but I'm hoping that, I know that Mr. Cameron saw my review, so maybe the new movies will be slightly different.
Maybe. I know in journalism too, I often bemoan the fact that Indigenous people are only in stories about Indigenous issues. And I always air quote issues because it always makes it seem like there's like some sort of problem, right? Like, another Indigenous issue. What is it this time? Let's hop in and talk to some Indigenous people. And yet Indigenous people are, surprise, normal people who drive in cars and go to university and do all kinds of normal things that could be, things we do stories on all the time. And yet try and find a story on any newscast about, that includes an Indigenous voice that is not about an Indigenous issue. Like, you can't do it. Do you find, is that important in movies? I mean, I think back and I think like maybe Die Hard, I don't know which number it was. But
Number 3. It was number 3. I know it by heart because it was a huge moment for me.
Comes up. Is there, but never comes up. He's just the detective.
And I so love that. And I'm looking at a photo of me and Graham that I have on my wall by my desk. I've known Graham for many, many, many years. And I remember he asked me, we did a thing on stage, and he asked me what my favorite movie of his was. And I said, Die Hard 3. And I said that because, because Graham, like, you're the detective, and he's the one that actually saves the school full of kids. Right? Like, Bruce Willis and Sam Jackson are off, like, chasing a bus or something in Central Park. Like, they're off, and it's Graham Greene who, like, saves the kids. You never know anything, but it's, like, clearly Graham Greene. It's clearly him, but you're right. It's never mentioned that he's just the cop that saves the day.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing that going, man, that's awesome. Like, I was just blown away. I mean, he's in Die Hard, and this is, I think, post Dances with Wolves. So he's like the Graham Greene at this point. He's Oscar nominated. Blown away. Likewise, it's why I always had a lot of time for like Corner Gas and, Lauren Cardinal's performance on that. Because again, I've known Lauren for a million years. He's a lovely guy. He's just Lauren on the show. Like, he's just performing this great character. He's hilarious. There's no major issue. He's just, one of the police again, interesting that they're both cops. I need to think about what that means. But again, I think that was, again, just lovely because I think, and it's not just our community that this happens to. It's like really all racialized communities. If they, for the longest time, if they appeared in a movie, it had to be because it was about their identity in some ways. I do think we do need to get to a place. I look forward to the place where that just isn't true. And I think we're getting there. I look at TV today. If you look at the ads and some of the shows, we're there, but we're not mentioned in that way. And I think that's good. And why is it good? It's because it does project, A, that we're just human beings, but also that we are just going to be around. Like, we may just pop up, like, on your TV screen. I dream of the day, Trina, like, where I turn on the radio to listen to a basketball game, and we're there.
Yeah.
Or, I've turned on, recently the Raptors have been using women, and I'm going to forget their names in this moment, but these fantastic women announcers. And it's like, that's new. I haven't heard a woman call a basketball game. It's so great. And it's, you immediately don't forget. And so I think we just need to get there where we can all be present in all these places and it's not a big deal. And of course, the irony is, like, that's what these cultures preach, but they don't ever practice that sort of thing. And so the fact that it's extraordinary that we can just be ourselves and not have our identity be forefronted or foregrounded in how we're portrayed. The fact that that's so unique is actually a pretty damning statement for the entertainment industry, because of course, non-racialized people, white people, they can be everything in the show. They don't ever have to have anything about themselves, or
no.
They can just be the doctor or the cop or whatever, the whoever.
Yeah.
So I look forward to that, and we'll get there. I think that's coming.
Well, there is progress. I will say, though, that I just read, because you open your book you know, I think the first line of your book is, you know, you remember exactly when you knew you were an Indian. I think I just paraphrased, but the exact moment I learned I was an Indian. And it's the, you know, the war whoop, you're on the baseball field, and that's targeted at you because you're the only Indian there. I will use air quotes for an Indian. And that is in probably what, the early 80s, if I'm right, or late 70s, right around, you know, I think you said you were 10. And then just like in the last couple of days, I'm reading, and of course you talk in the book a lot about mascots and all that stuff, and we see like the, you know, tomahawks.
Oh yes, that thing.
And yeah, now just in the last couple of days, Disney is apologizing for this racist performance by the Indianettes, who are, I don't know, like a marching, I'm not sure what the group is, but they perform and then they do the war whoop, and it's like the same. And I'm like, it is 2022. And so, you know, do you feel like maybe we're going in a circle, but maybe the circle is at least going forward, but we still, I don't know how, like when you see that, what's your sort of visceral reaction to that?
Well, I mean, my visceral reaction, so, I mean, of course it's appalling, but I would say the differences are Disney apologized in 2022.
Yes, that's true. That is true.
You know, when they released Peter Pan, you know, into movie theaters, they didn't apologize about that. I don't think they've still apologized about that. So that's the difference. I think there's a difference in that I would hope that if that actually, you know, I relate in the book that there was an incident while I was writing the book, I think in 2018, where a hockey team, First Nations hockey team, had the exact same taunt made at them.
First Nations elite. Yeah.
Yeah. And I hope that like 4 years later, maybe we've learned, like, because the reality is if you hear that noise, it's not appropriate. Like and so if it's especially on a, you know, I was going to say especially on a sports time, if you hear the noise, period, not good. But like on a playing field, I would hope other parents would step in, because, you know, part of what I write in the book is like no one stepped in. Like my folks didn't talk about it. My grandmother very well might have been at the ballpark that day because she lived right across the street and was there all the time. The other parents, like, the parents of the children who made the noise, they certainly didn't talk about it. It was not addressed. And it's interesting, when my sister read that part of the book, and I related that story actually on the radio once, she remarked to me that she remembers a lot of other incidents where that I have maybe blocked out of my memory, where she said the kids would surround me on the playground making that noise, or she said, that was all the time. And I said, I remember that one on the ball diamond, being really specific. So I don't think we're going in a circle. I think we're breaking that cycle a little bit. And I think, because listen, you know, when I started writing the book, there was still a team in Washington, D.C., a football team in Washington, D.C., with one of the most racist team names I've ever heard in my life.
That is true.
They don't exist anymore.
Yes.
Right? So, like, and that owner said he would never change it. And I said on the radio the day he said it, he will change it. And one of us was right, and it was not him. And so, like, that cycle is being broken. I think my kids will end up sort of growing up probably not even remembering that was a thing.
Yeah.
And Disney would do wise to make sure that stuff goes away, because frankly, you know, let's put it this way, Disney is like, when you release your movies and stuff, and this is the other key thing that has changed, which is, we were never considered to be part of the audience, ever. We were never regarded as, an Indigenous person might watch this. Like, never was that thought. And I guarantee that was still the thought when those dancers took that thing in Disney World or wherever that was. They never thought, which is a ridiculous thought in 2022. Yeah. But the point should be now, we are in your audience. And you can't get away with that stuff. And if you say that, we are going to demand things, just like people are demanding Disney do the right thing around that appalling bill around gay and lesbian teachings in schools. It's like, no, you have to do better. Just like at one point, people would not have regarded members of the LGBTQ2S community as their audience. Yeah. Now they do.
Yeah.
They've seen the power that those folks are in the audience, and better yet, they want those folks in their audience.
Yeah.
Disney, you want us in our audience too. Everyone does. And so you need to change that stuff. But I think we are breaking that cycle, and I think it's great, because I think if not my kids, certainly my grandkids are going to grow up never knowing that is a thing, and I'm pleased with that.
I'll ask one final question, because I asked initially what feedback you were getting, and then the other part to that question is my double barrel question, which I think I'm just asking the other part now. Is what your family thought. But it's kind of interesting because you said there's memory. You don't it is a memoir, and so it's your memories. There's things that didn't make the book. We were talking a little bit about that beforehand.
Yeah.
But what was your family's reaction to this book?
I mean, I'm thankful. I'm happy to report, mostly really, really pleased with it. I mean, there were some members of the family I sort of actively engaged, particularly around sort of family history, that I wanted to make sure I got right.
Yeah.
So there were some folks, my sister and my parents, those like who sort of, I would say, lived more closely to it. I didn't, because I sort of didn't want them. I didn't want them to like change what I was saying, and they have such an influence on my life in general because I love them so much, and that they would, although I did ask my sister if it was okay if I called her a badass, and I think she may have made me take it out. Anyway, like there was something like that.
I would have demanded that be left.
I think maybe it's still in there. There was something she asked me. It's just a reference to her work, where she was like, no, don't say that, because I don't need that. But otherwise, no, they've been very pleased. I see my cousin Zach was asked a question on IG where he all he says is it just says I'm very proud of you, and it's an honor to call you family, and I love you too, Zach. And so I think generally I think it's been very positive. I think some of the side of my family, like Zach, who are from the sort of non-Indigenous side, for some I suspect they might have learned a few things about the family and the experience of it all. Frankly, I think my parents learned, because, I haven't lived with them for most of my life at this point. And they didn't, some of the things around my interactions with police and I kept from them because I didn't want them. Well, I felt a lot of shame and I didn't want them to know. So I think all of that, I think in general, they've been very pleased. I think my community's very happy with it, and I think my grandmothers are happy. So if all of that, frankly, if I've done that, then that's good enough for me.
Well, that is a perfect place to end. We didn't get to talk about your sister and the cats, the scenes that didn't make the book. Have to happen at another time. That will happen at another time, I hope.
That's the second book, Trina.
Second book, yeah, part 2. Well, Miigwech, Walalan, Jesse, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, and for the book, because it resonated with me. I think you're right that personal story is a way to find commonality, and but also to approach some really just really vital, critical conversations that are so important to have, and some questions that are important to raise. And so I thank you for that, Walalan.
Again, thank you so much, Trina. It's been a real pleasure and honor to have this conversation with you. And miigwech, and thank you all, everyone, for stopping by and taking a view. And thank you to Writers Trust of Canada.
Yes, thank you. Walalio, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.